Welcome to episode 55 of Lucretius Today. I'm your host Cassius, and together with my panelists from the EpicureanFriends.com forum, we'll walk you through the 6 books of Lucretius's poem and discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. We encourage you to study Epicurus for yourself, and we suggest the best place to start is the book Epicurus and His Philosophy by Canadian professor Norman DeWitt. For anyone who is not familiar with our podcast, please check back to episode 1 for a discussion of our goals and our ground rules. If you have any questions about that, please be sure to contact us at EpicureanFriends.com for more information. In today's podcast, we will continue with one of the most important sections from Book 4 of the poem, starting around Latin line 469 and continuing through 521. And we're discussing how reason is dependent upon the senses, and including some controversies that apparently developed in the history of Epicurean thought regarding how best to explain that. Now let's join the discussion with Elaine reading today's text.
And the reason is not able to assign a cause why an object that is really foursquare when near should appear round when seen at a distance. Yet, if we cannot explain this difficulty, it is better to give any solution, even a false one, than to deliver up all certainty out of our power to break in upon our first principle of belief and tear up all foundations upon which our life and security depend. For not only all reason must be overthrown, but life itself must be immediately extinguished unless you give credit to your senses. These direct you to fly from a precipice and other evils of this sort which are to be avoided, and to pursue what tends to your security. All, therefore, is nothing more than an empty parade of words that can be offered against the certainty of sense. Lastly, as in a building, if the principal rule of the artificer be not true, if his line be not exact, or his level bear in to the least to either side, everything must needs be wrong and crooked. The whole fabric must be ill-shaped, declining, hanging over, leaning, and irregular, so that some parts will seem ready to fall and to tumble down, because the whole was at first disordered by false principles. So the reason of things must of necessity be wrong and false, which is founded upon a false representation of the senses.
Thank you, Elaine. We are today reading the second part of what we started last week, and so someone listening along would probably want to go back and read the entire section starting around the lines that says, lastly, if anyone thinks he knows nothing, he cannot be sure that he knows this. Because the section we're talking about today, these 2 passages, are pretty much a summation of the argument that it's been going on for quite a while in Book 4. And after this, the argument turns in a different direction. So this is really a sort of dividing point in Book 4 as to one of the major topics. But there's an awful lot here to discuss. And so we wanted to pay special attention to these passages and not just combine it all last week. So,
let Martin go first.
Martin, go. Martin, explain this to us, please.
Yeah. The most a bit surprising thing is the statement, it is better to give any solution, even a false one.
Yes. Okay. What do you interpret that to mean? You know, in everything we're doing, we pretty much ought to be talking 2 levels, one of which is to make sure we explain and understand what it is that Lucretius and Epicurus are saying, and then, of course, giving our own opinion about how to apply it to our lives and what it really does mean and should mean to us today, given all that we know today. So how do you interpret what he's saying there, Martin?
Yeah. First, I need to figure out why is this not in contradiction, or to resolve the contradiction to that she, at other occasions, he clearly states that we don't have to form an opinion if we don't have enough input, so we can leave it open.
So I think I understand that. Do you think you do?
I think I do too. Elaine, you want to go ahead and...
Okay, so I think the only thing that he's wanting us to remain certain about is that our senses are how we get information about reality. I don't think he's saying that we need to have certainty about our explanations, because that's silly, because then your observations can contradict your explanations. You need to be able to overturn them. But I think he's saying this basic first principle of belief is that we actually are interacting with reality. We're perceiving reality through our senses. And if you say that fundamental thing isn't true, then, what do you have? You have nothing. So if our senses actually can perceive things in altered ways, like we can be colorblind or whatever. But the only way somebody is going to be able to convince me that I'm colorblind is, at a minimum, they have to talk to me. So I'm using my ears. There's no way that I can get information, even when I'm having a dysfunction like nearsightedness or whatever, unless I am using my senses to get more information. So ultimately, everything that we get, besides feelings, if we're not getting it through our senses, there's just really no other way that we're getting reality information. So that is what they call a first principle or an a priori assumption, because you can't prove it with anything else. You have to have that assumption or you can't go anywhere else. So I don't think he is at all saying that you need to have certainty in your solutions or your false solutions or whatever. It's just that it would be better to have that kind of certainty than to lose your confidence that your senses are giving you information about reality.
I completely agree with what Elaine just said. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I do agree. But there's something I wanted to touch up from last week, actually, about certainty.
Well, Charles, before you go there, though, let's make sure we're okay on the major point, because what I think Elaine is explaining in response to Martin's question is that what's being discussed here is the high-level issue of the fact that the senses themselves are our ultimate authority and contact with reality. He's not saying that the certainty of any one particular conclusion has to be accepted. He's not saying that any one particular sensation at a particular moment has to be accepted. He's saying that the faculty of sense has to be accepted as our ultimate connection with reality because we haven't got anything else.
We haven't got anything else. And he's not even saying that certainty in a solution or a false one is good. Right? It's
right.
kind of like it would be better to cut off your arm than to, commit a sin with it, or whatever, poke your eye out. I don't know in the Bible. So it's not saying, oh, yeah, false certainty is great and you should stick to your conclusions because losing certainty is a bad idea. He's not saying that. He's contrasting one thing that he doesn't want you to do with another thing that would be even worse.
Okay. And also, Elaine, I think it would probably be a good idea for us to compare. This translation uses the word certainty, but it looks to me like that Monroe and Bailey, and especially Monroe, who is always, to my observation, more literal than anyone else. Monroe talks about it's better to state erroneously the causes of each shape than to let slip from your grasp on any side things manifest and ruin the groundwork of belief. And Bailey uses the words, rather than to let things clear seen slip abroad. So it would be wrong
it's the same
to focus.
Sense.
It is, but we're not talking about certainty in a high-level logical method. We're talking about just our confidence in the fact that we can see things clearly over time and with experience.
The feeling of knowing, where the sensation of knowing, like we talked about last time. There's a sensation you get when you're like, I know this, and that's what I see him saying. Don't let go of that when it comes to your senses, or what else do you have? So you could be delusional. You could have people that are losing their sight can start to see cartoon figures, and but how can you be convinced those aren't real besides just kind of like, well, you can't touch them, you can wave your hand through them, there's nothing there. Somebody's going to have to help you, or at some point you'd have to have gotten other information through your senses to know that is not correct. So you're still ultimately relying on your senses and not on reason to know.
Or not on God's or anything else.
The
basic point is just that your senses are all you have. Before we go back to Charles, Martin, what do you think about what we've said?
Yeah, it makes sense. I don't disagree with this, but I still feel it's that we do not have to give a solution. No?
Well, and so you're pointing out the fact that he's talking about better to give a solution even if it's false, and you're saying that conflicts potentially with the idea of waiting when you're not certain of something. I see your point in analyzing that, but I don't really see that as a major contradiction myself. Elaine, do you see a way to satisfy Martin on that point?
Martin, do you agree that because of incompleteness, that in any model we have to have, some a priori assumption?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that's all he's saying. So I don't think it conflicts with anything else. And I have seen this quote be misused to caution against questioning conclusions, and I don't think that that's appropriate. I don't think that that's what he's saying.
I wanted to bring that up too with this.
Yeah.
About how this could be misconstrued as a sort of endorsement or proof of dogmatism.
Yeah.
That's basically the subject we're talking about right now, I think, Charles. Is that a good way to say it, or do you want to say it in a different way?
No, that's basically what I wanted to bring up about the dogmatism part, about how that is just another concern.
Yeah, I think this translation with the word certainty makes that more of a clear issue. But I totally agree with everything that Elaine has said here. I think that what he's talking about is the general position that the senses are your faculty of perception of all the information you're ever going to get. And so you can't lose confidence in that faculty, or else you're just never going to have anything else that you can get any information through. You're totally going to be at the mercy of anybody who wants to lead you around through all sorts of, whether it be mystical or formal logical arguments, anything. He's just making the general point that the senses are our contact with reality. And he's making it in response and in opposition to the prior philosophers who had made the point that the senses are not reliable. He's not making the statement in a void. He's not making the statement just out of the blue. This was a huge issue in philosophy, I guess, then and now, about whether the senses are sufficient to let you know what you need to know to live happily, or whether in the end you have to go to God, or you have to go to some other, again, formal, logical, or forms, or idealism. That's the reason Plato apparently had this let no one enter who doesn't know geometry over his... Is it geometry? Anybody want to correct me on that? I think it's geometry as opposed to...
It's geometry. It's geometry. Because within mathematics, there were also two schools. It was explicitly against this numerical school.
Right, and because they were saying that unless you know those kind of geometrical, mathematical types of ways of looking at things, you can never attain truth itself. The senses will never be capable of giving you truth. And so Epicurus was four square against that position, and he's explaining it in these passages.
And since our conversation has deviated far from what I was originally saying, I just put in the forum response. It was a little note about 10 devotees witnessing a miracle and using that as a source of certainty. But that doesn't hold up to the materialist position.
Yeah, I mean, if 10 people tell you that they saw something, then that's more evidence that they saw it than if one person did. But if 10 people or 100 or 1,000 come to you and say they saw something that just cannot be, then you're still going to have strong grounds for treating it very skeptically. What would you say about that, Elaine?
Say it again.
Well, Charles is raising the point that, if 10 people come to you and say they witnessed a miracle of some kind that would be supernatural and just from our perspective as materialists just cannot be, then the fact that 10 people tell you they saw it carries maybe a little more weight than if one person saw it, but it doesn't really
depend. It doesn't, though. It depends on who those 10 people are, what your credibility assessment of them, and the more bizarre, that principle that the more bizarre an assertion is, the more evidence you're
extraordinary
want.
Claims need extraordinary
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so there's plenty more than 10 people who will tell you the Earth is flat. So I don't really care how many people come tell me that.
But at the same time, I made sure to include that miracles, by their very definition, are exceptions, and they don't hold up to a materialist position of being repeatable and observable with sensory experience.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So, I mean, There their a priori criteria for what is real. I mean, they're starting from a different place in reason, but how did they really get there? How did they get any of their information? They got it from, so like how do we make credibility assessments? We have to use our senses to get to know people. There's no way we could read a book like the Bible without some kind of, eyes or braille or having it be read to you. So they're just not understanding, they're not observing the extent to which they are depending on their senses and on reliability and predictability. So it's a matter of insufficient observation rather than, they're just not paying enough attention.
Let's continue going through this first passage as closely as we can, and let's take the next sentence or two up to the point where it talks about the empty parade of words. Let's save that sentence for next, but let's talk about this next passage that says, "For not only all reason must be overthrown, but life itself must be immediately extinguished. Unless you give credit to your senses, those direct you to fly from a precipice and other evils of this sort which are to be avoided, and to pursue what lends to your security." It's basically the same point we're talking about, but anybody have anything specific? These passages right here, I think, are true. Well, to the extent he's repeating for emphasis, I think, because this is so emphatically important. So what about the point about reason would be overthrown?
Well, so the process of reason is dependent on observation. So if you can't make any observations, what are you going to have to reason with?
Well, now you say that, Elaine, but I don't think, but Plato would probably disagree with you.
Well, Plato was wrong. I mean, if you've never gotten any sensory input, we start getting sensory input in utero. If we had been completely deprived of any sensory input, I have no suspicion that anything like reason would ever develop in the brain, because it wouldn't have any object to act on.
Martin, make sure that we're saying the right thing here, because I'm thinking this would be a good point to draw in that geometry or those abstract sciences like that, they are not based on observation. You cannot observe a line with no width. Is that a correct way of going and looking at that? Geometry doesn't start with observation, really, does it? Or does it?
It was motivated by it. I mean, it was motivated by observation. And it's in general like this. Almost everything in mathematics was motivated by observation. And then the mathematicians were thinking about it, how put this together based on some logic principle. And then they created this in a way which is disconnected from reality then eventually, because they just create a system which is logically consistent and then comes to something. So that's why you have these idealized things, because for these idealized things you can make this easy logic and draw from conclusion on it. But the price they pay for this is that there's no guarantee that the conclusion matches reality. So it's rather by incidence that we find out that typically what the mathematicians tell, if the model is reasonably good, fairly matches what we see in reality. But it's by no reason something what we can expect to be always the case. So in that sense, the mathematics becomes disconnected from the sensory input. But originally, about every branch of mathematics or subjects worked on has been motivated by sensory input.
Well, now, when you say they're motivated, I would say that's such a general statement that to some extent everything in life is motivated by the observations and the senses. I mean, they wouldn't have come up with the idea of coming up with geometry if they did not observe things first and want to come up with some way of manipulating them. But when they start talking about imaginary numbers or lines that are a single point in width that have essentially no width, they're specifically saying that these things cannot and never will be and are impossible to observe, right?
Yeah, because mathematics doesn't need this observation. It's because they just built it from logic. And but the thing is, I very much hesitate to attack logic and mathematics because of this, because in practice it works too well too often. So we put ourselves in we lose credibility if we hammer too much on these things, how wrong mathematics is, because it's not really wrong. No?
Okay, now that's going to take us in a very deep direction. But first of all, whether we attack them or not, I think the best starting point would be to acknowledge that there's a difference of opinion here. That Epicurus is saying that reason will be overthrown unless you give credit to your senses and ultimately base things on observation. And Plato and others are saying that's wrong. Epicurus is saying to Plato, you're wrong. And so they're both saying you're wrong to each other. Now, we can, as far as whether in the end a logical science like geometry ends up being useful is another question, I guess. Elaine, what are your thoughts on that?
I wouldn't have any idea how Plato would have ever gotten an idea of geometry if he had never had any sensory input in his whole life, or how he would even communicate with anybody to let us know what was going on. So I suppose that's maybe an unanswerable question.
Well, that's why we would say Plato was wrong.
Yeah.
But in terms of Martin's last comment was that he would hesitate to attack Plato too strongly because in the end of the science...
No. Not Plato. Mathematics. Not Plato. The Plato we can attack. I have no problem with that. He was completely wrong in that aspect. No, the thing is we shouldn't equate mathematics with idealism. Unfortunately, it seems a lot of mathematicians fall in that same trap. But you can look at mathematics from a completely different perspective and be fully compliant with mathematics without becoming a Platonist. And so that is a distinction we need to do. No? So that mathematicians are not automatically Platonists. No? It's their choice, and it's a wrong choice. No? But it's a choice they can make based on their freedom of opinion. No?
I'm good with that. I mean, Elaine or Charles, do you have another comment on what Martin just said?
I mean, yeah, I agree with it. And also about how Plato could think of geometry without sensory experience. I find it hard to try to come up with a three-sided shape without visual representation to distinguish that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, then the very last sentence is basically what Elaine and we've been saying the whole episode so far, is that all therefore is nothing more than an empty parade of words that can be offered against the certainty of sense. I think that's a very strong, firm, and pretty clear way of making the point. Anybody have any comment about the way he's making that point?
Parade of words is pretty interesting.
I guess I would just like to clarify from you, Cassius, because we've discussed this specifically, that you agree that he is not saying it's healthy or good for you to hold on to false conclusions just in order to experience certainty, that he is using this as an example of a bad thing, but not as bad as this other bad thing.
Oh, yes. Well, the way you say that, I don't think I have any problem with that at all.
Okay, because you've used it differently in the past, and if we're in agreement on that now, I am really totally thrilled with this whole day.
well, that's great. That's great. It's interesting how communications can be unclear sometimes, and maybe when I say something more as an attempt to explain it, I'll just get myself more off in a different direction. But the main point or issue that I see in all this, and this is something that I have some more things to bring up if we finish the passage today. But what I'm seeing going on here is that there is, in addition to the obvious statements that he's making here, you could read these sentences here as being very clear without any knowledge of Plato or Aristotle or any of these other guys. I think the basic point here stands on its own. However, I think also that many of the people reading this are going to be familiar, at least at the time he was writing it in particular, with those other ideas, and they construct all these logical arguments that they've used to intimidate people, basically, because I don't think they're true. I don't think Plato's right about things taking precedence to the senses, but these other arguments have basically intimidated and or persuaded the majority of academics in the world as it was at the time Lucretius and Epicurus were writing, that in fact it is necessary to understand abstract logic and geometry and mathematics in order to gain truth. And so it's a continuing debate, it appears, that people go back and forth about whether in answering Plato and in answering these logicians, do you simply say you're wrong and point to observation, or do you attempt to unwind their own positions using their own logic against them? And my observation
I would use their observations,
right,
not their logic.
Right. And that's the issue that I'm, at least in my own mind, still open to what's going on here, because I think that possibly, and in fact, in my mind, probably Epicurus is using both techniques. And I'm not sure which is, and when I say Epicurus, I think it's also possible that the dispute that we're talking about developed more after Epicurus's time, because by the time we start talking about Cicero and what Torquatus is reported to saying, and what Diogenes Laertius is reporting even later than Cicero, they're both reporting divergences and differences within the Epicurean community. And I don't think all of those can be laid at the foot of Epicurus. I think some of those divergences and disagreements were wrong directions. And in that sense, Elaine, you may be exactly right about how you diagnose all these things. But those are things that I think are important to talk about. And I think that's been the source of much of our communication back and forth recently on some of these things. But
so how do you find out what works best to persuade somebody, reasoning or evidence? How would you find that out?
It's going to be totally contextual based on the person you're talking with.
But how are you going to find it out?
I'm going to use observation.
Yes.
Listen, I am totally with you that observation is the key.
So that's how you find out. So it may be that reason and logic are going to be more persuasive. If your reasoning doesn't have any evidence in it, it's hard for me to imagine how that will be. You got to make some kind of premise.
Absolutely.
But the only way to find that out, which one works, is by researching it. By making observations on what changes people's minds. So I don't know the answer to that. Other than the research on changing minds seems to show that if somebody's strongly one way, that giving them more reasons and evidence strengthens them in their position and is counterproductive. And so like on vaccine hesitancy, the best route is to align with their feelings and their values. And if you can trigger that, it's much more likely to get them with you than going by either reason or observations.
I agree with what you're saying as a general conclusion, but I'm telling you right now that if I were trying to persuade you of something versus trying to persuade Martin of something, I'd probably approach it a little bit differently.
You'd better give me evidence. Yeah,
Well, I'll give both. Right. But anyway,
I'm alert to the pitfalls of logic, so I'd be like, that's
right.
Feeling.
Right. But no, I was.
What did you say, Charles?
Yes,
what
Charles.
About feeling?
I didn't hear the first part of the before feeling.
What if it feels like, or like, shit, I just lost it off the tip of my tongue.
Basically, he said, what about feeling?
For me? Oh, yeah. Appeals to feeling affect me.
Feels like evidence.
Oh,
yes,
you mean like a sensation of knowing more than pleasure or pain? Or like the pleasure of knowing? That could get me.
Or just feeling is part of the evidence equation. I mean, whether somebody likes ice cream or chocolate or vanilla or whatever they like is a part of the evidence that your senses, and because remember there's three parts of the canon.
Well, I don't think he's talking. We're not talking about that. We're talking about which explanation feels better.
Mm-hmm.
Right, Charles?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and it will lead you to cherry pick the stuff that you just, it feels better. The feeling of knowing something is a pleasure typically.
And that's why, reason and evidence won't necessarily convince somebody. They'll just say, well, this one feels more correct.
Yeah, and that feeling of correctness is usually pleasurable for most people. It's like hitting a sweet spot. So that's why you got to appeal to their pleasure or their pain. If they're risk averse people, you can get them on the convince them on the pain aspect if they're risk averse.
Okay, just to keep us moving, let's direct our attention to the last of what we had reserved for today, which is the section that says, lastly, as in a building, if the principal rule of the artificer be not true, if the line be not exact or is level bare to the least to either side, everything must needs be wrong and crooked. The whole fabric must be ill-shaped, declining, hanging over, leaning, and irregular, so that some parts will seem ready to fall and tumble down because the whole was at first disordered by false principles. So the reasons of things must of necessity be wrong and false, which is founded upon a false representation of the senses. To some extent, this is just repetition for emphasis probably, but let's not by any means cut it short. I remember Cicero Torquatus talks about Epicurus being the master builder of human happiness. And so when I see the word artificer,
that was Lucian.
Was it Lucian?
I'm pretty sure that was Lucian.
Okay.
And,
all right.
So, I think what he's saying in context of the paragraph just before then is that if you say your senses are not the way that you connect with reality, then anything else that you come with after that is not going to be right. And so if you have, just in sort of general logic terms, if your premises are wrong, definitely your conclusions are going to be wrong, but you can say that by observation. You don't have to say that because it's a logical sentence. You can observe that if you start with misinformation, it just builds on itself and it'll snowball. You can add misinformation anywhere along the way. So you can start with a straight wall and add a crooked wall. And so like at every point, your observations have got to be accurate or you will go off in a crazy direction.
It's like not believing in evolution and then immediately jumping to aliens.
Yeah, yeah. Or believing in QAnon, and now I don't know. Do you want to have this anything that's current? But there,
I've avoided name dropping that on the forums.
All right, let me restate that. Believing in a conspiracy theory so strongly that when your leaders look like they've been discredited, you decide that they're secretly in power.
Oh, I've heard so many goddamn.
All right, we're going to have to be careful about straying too far into politics, but everybody knows what we're talking about.
That's true.
And everybody knows that it's a great example that there are people in this world today, although you could analogize it to religion and in many other different directions, who are just in the grip of the worst type of hallucination almost about the nature of reality and where things are, and they refuse to let go of their perspective, even to the point of going, how is that really that much different than the Christians going into the lion's den or snake handlers and so forth? They are so convinced of the reality of their perspective that they will just die for it.
And I want to point out in this, I just noticed this is really important. So where he's talking about the building, he's talking about if your tool is not correct. So it's not even just that you've started with a crooked floor, your first thing. It's that if you're using a wrong method,
right,
the
that's
whole
very
way,
important.
And so it's maybe not that you made one wrong decision to start with, but that you are using a wrong decision tool. So if you're using logic as your decision tool instead of observation, your building going to be crooked.
This is a good visual image of the point that he's making. While being careful with the words logical and reasonable, it's a very logical and reasonable explanation of why, in the end, you will have a collapsing structure. But it's also something you can visualize in your mind very, very easily. This is maybe the number one analogy that people use in life, it seems like sometimes, is the skyscraper and the foundations and so forth, because everybody's had direct contact with what's going on here. If you're building anything, probably from a cake in the oven to a skyscraper, if you start off wrong or use wrong
using the wrong
instruments,
tools. Let's say you're using the wrong size measuring spoon.
The rot in the core.
Yeah. So what would you, I wanted to ask something while you were saying that, and then I got, okay. What would you say, were you're tempted to use the words logic and reasonable, would you accept the substitution as also accurately descriptive? Like it makes sense because it describes accurately what we have
Yeah,
experienced.
we're continuing to talk about the same issue.
Yeah.
What concerns me is again the context of who we're talking to, because if we're talking to somebody who's listening to our podcast and who understands philosophy and the issues that are involved in formal logic and
Yeah.
idealism like Plato and so forth, if you can understand that, then clearly logic has a particular meaning to it. I just am concerned that in many instances, if someone who's listening to the podcast is not well versed in philosophy, that they may be tempted to use the words logic and reason in a very common
When they mean description. So but would you agree that what you're really describing is description, that this person is describing a building and it's the description is accurately similar to experience?
I think we should get Martin to answer that question, because I do hesitate a little bit, because I would say that we're talking about we're talking about the thought process. We're talking about a process that's involved, and just the word description may not be quite far enough in my mind. But Martin, you got a comment at this point?
Not yet. So I'm still not clear on what I would comment.
You see, okay, well, let's Elaine and I develop that a little bit further.
So what I want to avoid is when you talk about things like common sense and reason, that's actually the most inaccurate type of reasoning. And, DeWitt talks about that. So we don't want to be promoting that. That's not right. What we want to be promoting is, accurate communication. Does this describe a process the person has seen, or a process similar to what the person has seen? And it is a cognition. It is thinking. But reason is a real tricky term, because most people associate it with things like common sense, which are these human heuristics of sort of informal logic that are the worst, the most inaccurate. And I don't want to validate something that they really should be careful of.
Well, okay. Again, it's going to be, in my mind, we got just this contextual issue, because the words common sense and reasonable have many senses. You've just analyzed them as being potentially very deceptive and very inaccurate and very difficult and a very unreliable way of reasoning from a certain perspective. However, you can, I think, unpack the issues that are involved, and because I'm never going to be able to go. Supposing you were a lawyer and needed to go into court and needed to tell the jury what the judge is going to tell the jury as to what the law is, the judge is always going to tell the jury that they should apply the rules of the reasonable man, and they should talk about common sense and so forth. So there's a vernacular or a way of talking about things that these issues have to be explained to people, because the point you're making, I'm convinced, is a valid point. It's just a question of, in some context, you may have to use another legal term. You may have to lay a foundation before you can explain the point, the ultimate point that you're making there.
Okay, in law, that is a real interesting thing that you bring up. As far as I can tell, in law, the reason, the rationale, I use that word too much, the rationale for this, or explanation for this reasonable person standard, is that humans are all subject to these fallible heuristics, all of us.
Elaine, when you use the word heuristics, that may be a little bit more.
That means common sense, informal logic, like just assuming things like proximity being causation, like that if you go to Taco Bell, some fast food restaurant, and you get sick, that you're going to blame the food, even though it probably didn't have anything to do with that. So that's one of the human heuristics, or the sunk cost fallacy. So there's all sorts of mistakes that we make. And so the reason that the law asks you to go with what a reasonable person would think is that they understand that we're all subject to these fallacies. And so you're not asking a juror to say, well, what would a person who had perfectly overcome their failures of human logic, what would that person say? You're saying, okay, what would an ordinary person who is subject to these mistakes? So it's not doing that to make it more accurate. It's introducing observations, evidence about typical human failures. And unless people understand that, they're going to think that reasonable person is more likely to be right, when it's not true. But that reasonable person we're just saying that they're maybe wrong no more often than any other typical person.
Yeah, in fact, I think when you get really into the details of the law, the judges will generally talk about a reasonable person of ordinary experience and knowledge and so
yes,
forth. They
yes.
specifically are not saying that the reasonable person is going to use formal logic or some kind of sophisticated methodology.
Science.
Yeah, or science.
That they're not going to be you're introducing inaccuracy. So when we're talking about being accurate and understanding the nature of things, we want to make a distinction between the inaccuracies of common sense and common reasoning and formal reasoning, which is more accurate than common sense. And we want to say, okay, so if you really want to know what's going on, it's much more important to look at evidence. And, we can't stop using reason and heuristics. We're going to use it, but understand that it is tricky.
Okay, and with the first step always being looking at the evidence. And then when you talk about words like heuristics and so forth, I think what you're really getting at there is that you can look at the evidence, but then you process the evidence in some way. And the description of how we process that evidence is, I think, what you and I are talking about that has not been, that needs to be more articulated.
Yes.
And that would be beneficial to articulate. Go ahead.
When you're processing it, it's better to use, if you've got to process it, it's better to use some kind of correction for the errors of faulty innate heuristics. You're going to be more accurate if you use some kind of like statistics or formal logic corrections, like you got to correct your sunk cost if you really want to make good use of your money. So that's important. But those things still don't trump your observations.
Okay. I think that's a good place for you and I to stop. Charles and Martin.
No, I don't have any comment on this one. Sound reasoning.
Yeah, neither do I.
Is there anything in there that you disagree with what I said?
No.
Okay, then maybe as we begin to come nearer the end, the points that I wanted to raise that we would go from here is that I think what we've just been discussing has been apparently a source of debate. And let's just talk about the 2 or 3 instances where we have an example of where it has been brought up that there was a difference of opinion. And there's 2 main places that I would point to. We can talk about it today as much as we have time to, and then we can think about them in the future as well. But there's 2 places that I think in the text we see references to differences of opinion within the Epicurean community. The first one, at least in point of time, would be Cicero's own ends, where Torquatus is delivering his explanation of Epicurean ethics. And he is discussing the whole issue in terms of finding the final and ultimate good. And I think somebody at some point should have a debate as to whether the entire way he is phrasing this argument is even consistent with the way that Epicurus would have done it himself. But when he talks about it, he immediately talks about a divergent way of arguing it. He says that Epicurus finds the ultimate good in pleasure, and that he proves it by saying that every animal is, as it's born, seeks for pleasure and delights in the chief good, and it remains that way as long as it's unperverted. And so Torquatus says that Epicurus refused to admit any necessity for argument or discussion to prove that pleasure is desirable and pain is to be avoided. He said, just like as if Elaine was quoting him, he says, these facts, he thinks, are perceived by the senses as that fire is hot, snow is white, honey is sweet, and none of these things need to be proved by elaborate argument. It is enough merely to draw attention to them, as if Elaine had dictated that sentence. And then he says, for there's a difference, he holds, between formal syllogistic proof of a thing and a mere notice or reminder. The former is the method for discovering abstruse and recondite truths, the latter for indicating facts that are obvious and evident. And he says, strip mankind of sensation and nothing remains. It follows that nature herself is the judge of that which is in accord with or contrary to nature. And what does nature give us to judge? Except pleasure and pain. And here's the point the reason I went into this divergence.
I agree with that.
That's exactly the point that Epicurus raised, and that is Elaine's position. However, Torquatus then goes further and says, some members of our school, however, would refine upon that doctrine. So they're smarter than Epicurus, apparently. These say that it is not enough for the judgment of the good and evil to rest with the senses. The fact that pleasure is in and for itself desirable and pain in and for itself to be avoided can also be grasped by the intellect and reason. Accordingly, they declare, in opposition to Elaine, that the perception that the one is to be sought after and the other is to be avoided is a notion naturally implanted in our minds. I'm sorry, that's not in opposition to Elaine. Here's what's in opposition to Elaine. Others, again, with whom I agree, that's Torquatus talking, observing that a great many philosophers advance a vast array of reasons to prove why pleasure should not be counted as a good, nor pain as an evil, consider that we had better not be too confident of our case. In their view, it requires elaborate and reasoned argument and abstruse theoretical discussion of the nature of pleasure and pain. And I can't think of a more clear way to state a disagreement with Elaine's position than what I just read from Torquatus.
Well, Torquatus, he's saying that they say that, but not that he agrees with it.
No. He, in fact, says he agrees with that last position. Others, again, with whom I agree, consider that we better not be too confident.
Oh, well, that's just wrong. It's wrong.
This is an example.
This is an example. This is where I would say I would go up here with Lucretius, that if you break in on your first principle that you are experiencing pleasure and pain, and your experience that is how you value. When you think of anything that you value and try to remove feeling from it, it's meaningless. So if you really make a close observation of yourself, you will know that is how you are creating value with your feelings. And if somebody can talk you out of that you're experiencing pleasure and pain when you are, then your brain works way different from me.
Okay. Well, again, that's a great argument, and I agree with it. For the moment, I want to just emphasize that apparently this was a disagreement back then.
I never see Epicurus himself saying anything like that.
Yes, and I do not know that we can trust Cicero here because, of course, this is a dialogue that Cicero made up himself. Supposedly he had Epicurean text in front of him and he was quoting and so forth.
Right.
But we don't know really whether the real Torquatus, who apparently was really an Epicurean, would have said all this or not. Or this entire passage from Cicero could actually be a Ciceronian misrepresentation and mischaracterization of the Epicurean argument, because the rest of what he discusses in this passage really is a reason-based analysis of the situation. And he's just said that Epicurus refused to do that. So we have to be very careful, I think, with this section and on ends. And if you
look at the core texts, they support the first assertion that these are foundational, your senses and your feelings. And there's nothing in the core text that goes against that. So
okay.
I think we can stick with that. I don't think that there's absolutely any reason that we need to consider that's not correct.
Okay. Again, I'm just making the point so we know the parameters of the playing field here. The other one that we should consider if we're listing the evidences in the text for divergences of opinion here, the other one that stands out in my mind, we can go back to Diogenes Laertius. And in the section well into the letter where he starts talking about the divisions of the philosophy, he says, I'm reading the Bailey version, quote, logic they reject as misleading, for they say it is sufficient for physicists to be guided by what things say of themselves. Thus, in the canon, Epicurus says that the tests of truth are the sensations and the concepts and the feelings. And then he says, the Epicureans add to these the intuitive apprehensions of the mind. And then it says, and he says himself too in the summary addressed to Herodotus and in the principal doctrines. And then that paragraph goes on with a lot of important material about how the sensations are primary. But you also have here this disagreement between Epicurus and what appears to be other Epicureans or later Epicureans. Remember, Diogenes Laertius is writing, I think, in the 300 or so AD period. So he's several hundred years even after Cicero and much further in time away from Epicurus even than Cicero was. But there is this disagreement about whether the intuitive apprehensions of the mind are themselves one of the tests of truth. DeWitt says that it's obvious why they would not be. But apparently some Epicureans back then said that they were. And this intuitive apprehension of the mind is really not clear as to what that exactly means, because it's apparently not the same thing as anticipations, because anticipations
I thought you were talking about anticipation, so not.
No, because in fact that very sentence says, Epicurus says the tests of truth are the sensations, and Bailey uses the word concepts, but everybody else uses anticipations. So
or prolepsis.
Epicurus says the test of truth are sensations and concepts and feelings. Those anticipations or prolepsises and feelings. Those are the three things that Epicurus said. So these other Epicureans are adding something else to that.
Okay, so I think I might be able to clear that up for you.
Okay.
All right, so actually what they are talking about is probably our fast brain, which is based on observations. It's just that it's happening so fast that we are not applying conscious analysis. And it is also subject to flaws in pattern recognition. So you can't take it as being as accurate as other stuff. But an example, that there's a really cool book called The Gift of Fear, which sounds, like woo-woo pop psych, but actually what it is just talking about how people have unease when they're in the presence of malicious psychopaths, and they don't know why. People like Ted Bundy, they're like, they felt weird, but they didn't know why. And it breaks down some of the stuff we're noticing, like the slowed blinking rate and skin temperature, just some really subtle things like that our senses are noticing and are perceiving as not right, not fitting with what we are expecting from other humans. And those kinds of things should not be ignored because they are not perfectly accurate, but they're right often enough that, if you're out somewhere and you get a feeling like that around somebody, don't get in the elevator with them. Which brings me to my whole point. So it's not different from observations is what I'm saying. It's just they didn't realize that then because they didn't have access to the research we have now. But the whole reason to care about whether we're making accurate observations, accurate conclusions, the whole reason is so that we can make accurate decisions for pleasure, so that correctness of a conclusion is relevant insofar as it leads us in the right direction of making a choice that we're going to enjoy. Would you agree?
Yes. I don't have a problem with what you just said, because that's the ultimate test of everything. Is you've concluded that the goal of life is pleasure, so you're going to come back to that in the end.
You're going to come back to that. So why would it be a problem if you're using a inaccurate tool like common sense instead of actually looking to see what's going on? Because you may let your common sense lead you in a direction where you keep throwing, good money after bad because you've got this sunk cost.
Well, see, there's people out there who would say that would be a contradiction in terms, that the person who uses common sense would never throw good money after bad. They would judge the term common sense by the actual result. I just think there's a potential.
Well, okay,
confusion.
so there are common sense things, though. Examples are where people will make decisions that lead them away from their pleasure unless they take time to remember that might not be right. and why don't I look and see what is the evidence for this decision before I make it?
Right.
But is that always enough, though? Because, I mean, thinking of another heuristic, the gambler fallacy,
Which one is that?
where somebody, like, say, for example, in a poker game or a slot machine, where they are so consistently having bad cards or bad slots that eventually...
Oh, they think they've got to have a good one coming soon because
Yes.
they've used... Yeah, so you need to know about those things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's evidence, right? The reason we know that the gambler's fallacy is a fallacy is because somebody bothered to take time to look at the evidence and what's actually happening.
And my only point in these discussions is that I just want to make sure I know who I'm talking to, because there's going to be some number of people out there who would answer your hypothetical there by saying that the man who uses common sense is never going to gamble in the first place.
Yeah, people that are going to talk like that are probably not going to get a lot out of this because they're not going to bother to listen to enough explanation or enough observation, enough evidence about pleasure. That's the kind of person who's going to tell you that you're not supposed to seek pleasure for some common sense rule that there's something bad about it.
Okay, well, we've gone. By the time we edit this down, we may be a little bit long for the day, so maybe we ought to try to come to conclusions and make sure we've said everything we want to say for the day. So, Martin, when we get to this phase, we always look to Martin first.
We've covered now pretty much everything what's in these 4 paragraphs, except this one exaggerated statement about, but life itself must be immediately extinguished. To me, this feels very exaggerated. Okay, I understand if we don't trust our senses, we may doubt whether the abyss is there and fall into the abyss. Okay, then we are at risk. But I wouldn't say life gets immediately extinguished.
Let's see if there's a translation issue there. Let's look at the other.
The others are similar.
I mean, it's an exaggeration, right?
But they are similar, yeah. So you would all agree that this is
poetic hyperbole.
Yeah, I was going to say that just sounds more like an embellishment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good. That was all.
Okay, one of them says at once, and Bailey says straightway, and the other one says at once. Maybe Bailey's straightway might be the most preferable of the 3 that I see there, because you're certainly right about in terms of time. Certain people can do crazy things for unusual periods of time before they get punished by reality. But in the end, they usually do. Okay, Charles, conclusions, comments for today?
No, nothing
Nothing you haven't already said?
Haven't already. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Elaine.
I think this is a fantastic passage that really lays home the importance of accepting as a first principle that we are using our senses to connect with reality. And we don't even really have any other way to talk about reality except through our observations of our senses and our feelings.
And let me bounce off that by saying that you've just said it's a fantastic passage, and I completely agree. It's always been kind of interesting to me that this fantastic passage, which I think is one of the most important in the whole book, is kind of buried in the middle of the 4th book instead of being at the very beginning somewhere. And that's kind of
big bold letters.
Yeah. There are in earlier sections some statements. I remember there's one in book 1 to the effect that if you can't be confident about the things that are immediately in front of you, then you'll never be able to be confident about things that are unseen or further away. And so there have been hints of this in earlier books, but I think this is one of the most critical concepts of, and it's one of the things that everything is built on, is the reliance on the senses. So it probably says something very interesting that we don't have time to untangle today, but it's probably something very interesting that he did not think it necessary to explain this in this detail until the 4th book. So anyway, and of course, he's preceded it with a long discussion of images and illusions and things that have sort of set the stage. And now he's basically come to the payoff conclusion that the senses are the criteria of truth, and everything has to be referred back to them. And from there, he's going to move on to the section that Charles has been waiting for, love and marriage and things that go along with that. He doesn't turn to that immediately either. He talks about a few other things first, but we'll eventually get to that before we finish book 4.
No, I think the epistemology was more interesting.
Yes. Well, tell your girlfriend that and see what she has to say about that part.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, she started listening to them. She's almost done with the first episode.
And of course, one thing we'll have to discuss when we get to that is the constant question. It came up on the Facebook group this week. The constant question about whether Epicurus recommended in favor of or against marriage and children. So we have several evidences that help us analyze that. But the section that we're going to get to at the end of book 4 here is one of the most important parts that factor into that. So we'll get to that soon enough.
That's always been a bit of an absurd question because, like, you just have to look to the evidence.
Yeah, or in the context of a particular situation. You're not going to have a one-size-fits-all rule, I don't think, for that. But anyway, let's wait till we get to that point. Anything else for today, anybody? Because otherwise we will close. Okay, hearing nothing. Thanks, everybody, and we'll be back in a week or so.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, bye.